They say hunting and fishing can be dated back more than 2 million years. Throughout the years, the historic angler and hunter has steadily evolved into the avid hunter and angler that we know and love today. Welcome to the Outdoor Defiance podcast. As you listen, you will hear comical stories, companies talking about their products, researchers talking about their research, and overall ways to help you become a better outdoorsman. Welcome to today's episode.
Hey everyone, it's episode 13, and we're very excited about this week. We got this is the first time me and Gunnar have been on campus since graduating, so we're alumni now, which is a different feeling. But we have Dr. Chitwood here, and Dr. Chitwood, if you would, just go ahead and introduce yourself and kind of say what you do here at OSU.
Yeah, sure. First, thanks for having me on. Thanks for coming back to campus.
Yeah.
Finding your way to my office. I'm originally from Georgia and basically got into what I do because I like to hunt and fish and be in the woods and flip rocks and chase squirrels and rabbits and whatever it is that you do as a kid. And so that turned into, a career for me. So a lot of what I do is then focused back on game species and game species management. So I do a lot of big game work here at OSU, pronghorn, mule deer, turkeys, projects elsewhere on wolves and elk in other states, And I've been here now a little over 3 years. Might have even had Gunnar in a class, last spring maybe?
Yeah, I think so.
Something like that. But yeah, liking it so far. But Georgia boy that ended up going from North Carolina to Missouri to Montana and now Oklahoma.
Well, he ended up in the best state, I say.
Okay. That's fair.
So what made you get your degrees, or what are your degrees, and what made you decide that's what I want to do?
Yeah. So I have a BS. Actually, I have a BS in environmental sciences from UNC Chapel Hill. So it's not a ag school, but I was actually thinking about going to medical school when I did my undergrad, and got academic scholarship to UNC. So I am a Tar Heel. March Madness just wrapped up. I won my bracket pool, but unfortunately, because I picked the right title team, which was not UNC, and so then I did that, and then I worked for a couple of years in something unrelated. Always figured I'd go back to school, and kind of had this constant draw toward broadly ecology, right? Again, things that are outside, but also just the scientific process, and then taxonomically, I was drawn to things like white-tailed deer, elk. And so I ended up back in grad school at NC State, which, of course, is a UNC rival, and did make a deep run this year that, of course, nobody picked, as far as I know, or at least in my pool, they didn't. But I did my master's and PhD there, and those were in fish and wildlife degrees in a wildlife program, much like we have here in the Department of Natural Resource Ecology and Management. And then from there, I was a postdoc for a little while at NC State. Then I was a postdoc at University of Missouri, where I ran the elk research there, the restored elk herd in the Missouri Ozarks. And then I jumped from there to the University of Montana, where again, I was working on some elk stuff and some wolf stuff. And from there got this job. And so it can be described as a rat race to do the academic path. And in some ways it is, but all of that has been enjoyable for different reasons. And I have gotten to live in several different places in the country and work on different things and network with different people. But honestly, it all goes back to I'm doing stuff that I've always been interested in doing. But when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, you don't necessarily think like, oh, I could be a scientist and actually study turkeys or deer or elk or whatever. You just know that you want to be outside, and it's interesting that this animal does this and that animal does that. Well, now I get to actually ask those questions professionally.
Right.
Yeah.
So kind of give us a short run of like a lot of the research you've done. And then from there, we'll break into the two that we want to.
Yeah. Well, I launched even in grad school kind of into the deer world. So going way back to that'd be the late aughts. How do you say that? 07, 08, 09. I was working with white-tailed deer and did some stuff, then added in some stuff with coyotes. And then and then I worked on the elk in Missouri, and so kind of have always stayed in that game species, big game ecology vein. And now that I'm at OSU, I think y'all want to mostly talk about turkeys today, but we have an ongoing project with pronghorn in the Panhandle. We're about halfway through a 5-year project, collaring hundreds of pronghorn out there.
Oh, wow.
I've got a student who's working on an elk project that's still based in Montana. That's a project that I was involved with before I moved to OSU. And so we were able to get her funded here as a student, even as the rest of the project is based in Southwest Montana. And then, I'm affiliated with several other projects, even one that's run out of Clemson University that's with jaguars in Colombia, South America, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And we just started a big mule deer project that's funded here in Oklahoma. So
awesome.
Just this past, I guess that was first week of February, we collared the first mule deer that have ever been collared in the state.
Oh, wow.
And so that's kind of in the Beaver County and then the kind of the western edge of the downstate area, not deep into the Panhandle for that one. But yeah, and then turkeys is the other one. We've got several grad students working on our turkey project, but I think that's the one you want to talk about the most.
Right. So let's dive into the turkey research you've done. Kind of give us a spill of what you've done, and then we'll come in with some questions we have.
Okay. Well, it's kind of all predicated on the topic that y'all probably heard about a lot as hunters, right? And Oklahoma is not immune to the concerns about the wild turkey population declines. That said, you may have listeners that are like, well, I got plenty of turkeys around me. Yeah, there's some spatial variation in that, but by and large, there's growing evidence across a pretty large swath of the country, notably the southeastern U.S., where hunter harvest appears to have dipped. Hunter reports of what they're seeing, even landowner reports of what they're seeing kind of suggests turkeys are kind of declining. And then most importantly, a lot of state agencies collect poult per hen data, and that y'all know is kind of a metric of productivity. And in a lot of places that ratio is a lot lower than it used to be. And so kind of take all that together, and lots of states are now trying to attack that from as many different angles as they can to figure out, well, what's causing that. And I think now a lot of people are saying it's probably not one thing. It may be several things, and they may be ranked differently depending on what part of the world you live in. But that's really why Oklahoma has a project is ODWC, Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation.
Mm-hmm.
They funded it. They have some evidence that aligns with everything I just described. And so they thought, well, how are we going to address this? Right. Because obviously they're the ones that are going to be setting bag limits and season dates and all that. But if we don't know causes, then how can we alter management to address them? And so they put out a call for proposals back in, as right as I moved here. I started this job, I think, January 1 of 2021. And by February, I was a part of this project team submitting a proposal to ODWC, which was officially accepted for funding later that year. And then we started catching our first turkeys in January of 22 in Southeast Oklahoma. So some of your questions may go deeper into that. We are working on Easterns and Rios, and we could talk about some differences there, but that's really what started it all. And I've dabbled with a little bit of turkey stuff in the past. I know a lot of people that do turkey research, but I was able during my PhD to work with some turkey data sets where I was doing my deer work. I was also helping a different grad student catch turkeys for his project. So it's kind of fun to have that in my background. But as soon as I moved here, realized I had an opportunity to work on turkeys myself,
right,
as a lab director.
So I know through the last couple of years, Gunnar and I have sent in it's meat off the drumstick, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are you doing with that?
So that's we call it the genetic objective, right? So a lot of the stuff I'm responsible for here at OSU involves capturing Easterns in extreme southeast Oklahoma and some Rios in extreme southwestern Oklahoma. They're getting backpacks and leg bands. And again, we could go into that if you want. But separate from that, we have a partnership with Cesar Clayburgh Wildlife Research Institute, CKWRI, which is based at Texas A&M University, Kingsville, in extreme South Texas.
Okay.
And so the funding comes to us from ODWC, but then we do what's called a subaward, and we route some of that to them. Well, they have a genetics lab that we don't have. And one of the objectives that we wanted to work on with ODWC was using genetics, right? So DNA that comes from a biological sample to look at, you can look at relatedness of individuals. You can look at potential signatures of gene flow among populations, all under the idea that we might be able to see whether or not at landscape scale, talking about the whole state of Oklahoma, are there barriers to movement that could have something to do with decline? And especially in Western Oklahoma, I think it's a pretty cool question. And y'all may be out there even more than I am. Y'all know, a lot of folks that live out that way. One of the most common comments that I've heard as this project started was, well, we used to winter 200 birds. Now we see 20.
Yeah.
Or we used to winter 300 birds. Now we see 25. Well, there's two options. Either a bunch of those are dead, which is one problem, or they moved, which the good news is that means they're not dead.
Yeah.
But also that means we may not understand how those winter roosts are or are not changing. And if there's barriers to that genetics could show us, we can't collar enough or backpack enough turkeys to pretend to identify every barrier with GPS data. So that's where the hunters come in, is hunters are hunting all over the state, private land, public land, whatever. And by sacrificing that tiny little piece of meat, an eraser on a pencil is all we need, out of the drumstick, off the breast, whatever, we're able to basically get the genetic signature of that male turkey. And if we can do that enough times across the whole state, you can start to build a picture genetically of where there might be constraints to movement. Because at the global scale, obviously, if populations got isolated enough where they couldn't exchange DNA, they're not even exchanging individuals, then if something bad happens to one of those, that population could just blink out. Right. And so again, in Western Oklahoma especially, I've been wondering about that because I've heard too many times a rancher say something like that, well, we used to see this many, now we see so many fewer. So that's the 3-minute version, I guess, that's an entire PhD project.
Yeah.
They have a PhD student based in Kingsville. His name's Michael Barrett. And all those requests that come out, whether they come from OSU, NWTF, ODWC, or directly from CKWRI, all those samples are ultimately going to land in Michael's lab in South Texas, where they have the genetics lab. And that's their part of this bigger Oklahoma project, is to focus on the genetic component.
Gotcha.
So how long has this project been going, you said, since?
I think we kicked off in January of 22.
Okay.
So the eastern captures, the eastern hens in McCurtain County, we just wrapped up our 3rd winter capture of 4. So we'll catch birds one more winter down there with backpacks, January, February, March of 25. And then on the Rio side, we were by design 1 year later in starting. So that student, whose name is Cody, just wrapped up his 2nd year of Rio capture in Southwest Oklahoma, and he'll have one more coming again this coming winter.
Okay.
So we're about kind of halfway through about a 5-year project timeline.
Gotcha. I know you might not, have you seen anything out of that genetic data yet that you could point towards anything yet, or is it just too early?
Just too early. I'd be happy to share it if we had it, but they've just gotten their first big wave through. So there's so many steps. And I don't even understand. This is why you partner, right?
Yeah.
Like, we don't have this lab here. Also, I don't have the skills to do all the analytics myself. So when it goes to him, he keeps us updated, of course, because we have to report everything. There are quite a few steps that are almost, you could describe some of it as like QA, QC. Everybody knows what that means, right? Just because a tissue sample gets turned in, unfortunately, doesn't mean it always gets used. And it may not even be the fault of the hunter. we don't want you to turn in a big chunk of meat. So
Yeah.
don't do that. But sometimes it's, for whatever reason, it was degraded, or it wouldn't amplify in the system. So what I do know is a whole batch has been processed all the way to the point where they're now ready to start analyzing it.
Okay.
And those samples would have come from spring of 22 and spring of 23. And now we're in kind of the final spring. That's the plan anyway, that we're not planning to take tissue beyond this year, but the recent pushes coming out on social media are to hopefully fill in some of the missing counties, where, some counties are well represented because maybe there's a lot of public land and
Right.
a lot of people go there. Or maybe there's a couple big ranches that host some hunts, and we're able to leverage that for lots of samples. But in an ideal world, you would distribute all those samples across every county, because then you've got full continuity across the state of Oklahoma. And so I hope in another year that we'll be able to answer that question more directly.
I got you.
Yeah.
So if someone's wanting to send in a sample, where can they do this at?
So the best thing, and I should have had one of these because you got the video. I got a handful of kits over in the corner, but the best thing to do is, we're blasting everything out through social media, is we don't want to send kits that don't get used, because there is they're not super expensive, but there is a cost, right? Michael had to put them together. They've all got to be labeled, and there's little vials in there. So what we actually ask is, if hunters know this is coming, it's okay if I don't know you yet. But if you hear this on the podcast, or you see it on Instagram or whatever, then they get a hold of me through email or Instagram, or they reach out to NWTF or ODWC. There's lots of people that know this is going on, and then we'll just mail you a kit. You don't have to really do anything. The easiest thing to do is, when you're processing the bird, just cut off a little chunk of meat, like a little dime-sized chunk of meat, stick it in a baggie, and you can stick it in the freezer. Just know what bird that came from,
Right.
and where it was. We're not trying to steal anybody's hunting spot, but it's better data to have the actual lat long, right, or the onyx point of where it was at. Worst case, county. If somebody's really uncomfortable with their hunting spot, county's probably good enough, but some counties are big, and
Right.
the difference in the eastern edge and the western edge could be 40, 50, 60 miles. Or whatever,
Absolutely.
Right. So if you hold that chunk, then by the time I'm able to actually mail you the kit, you just defrost the little chunk of meat, and there's a little tool in there. It's a biopsy punch, and you just punch it through, and it takes that little eraser size piece that goes in a vial. There's 3 little lines of information you put on a card, and that all gets mailed back. So it's really simple, and it's also, if people know about it, they don't have to have a kit in hand to contribute. Just
Right.
have to know to save that piece of tissue. Does that
Yeah,
answer your
absolutely.
question?
So when you guys are putting on the backpacks, and did you say leg bands too?
Mhm.
How many birds have you at this point have you guys captured?
We've been, let's see, gosh, you'd think by now I'd have a number memorized, but the numbers come and go.
Right.
We're usually, so this is the 3rd year of the Easterns. I think every year we've marked 30 to 36. So over the course of 3 years, we've handled, around 90 unique hens. We've handled a few males that get caught incidentally. They get leg banded usually, but they're just released without a backpack.
Right.
And then on the Rio side, again, we're 2 years in, and he's transmitted now probably 60 something hens.
Wow.
He's handled a few more because his trapping techniques are a little, well, basically I always say the joke that Rios are dumb enough to walk in a mousetrap.
Yeah.
So, and no disrespect, but like Easterns can be real finicky. We're shooting rocket nets over them. But the Rios, if they go in a trap and he only needs to mark 6, but he's got 9, well, he might have caught 80 or 90 birds himself to mark the 60. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
In that case, some of those hens are getting released without a backpack, and in some cases, maybe even released without a leg band, because we want to stress as few birds as little as possible.
Absolutely.
And they're pretty robust. These capture techniques have been used for decades. They've been used to translocate turkeys. But our job as wildlife professionals, right, and me as a lab manager, we try to minimize everything, because we don't want our processes to make something worse for a hen.
Absolutely.
And so, but yeah, so we're sitting at probably, what I add that up, combined across the state, 150-ish backpacked turkeys over the
Oh, wow.
last few years, with still more to come for one more winter.
Do you have you guys had any loss, like after backpacking?
For like associated with capture?
Well,
Or
afterwards, like found out like a dead turkey.
Oh, sure. Well, and some of them. So I guess there's two ways to answer that. In dead turkeys, sure, we find them dead on a nest even months later. But related to capture, we do take a pretty conservative approach. So that in scientific words, that's called capture myopathy, right? So there's only a couple ways that you could, in theory, kill a turkey. One would be a traumatic injury at capture, right? So that'd be like if I darted a deer and it ran off while it was getting drugged and broke its leg. Well,
Right.
Now my capture effort on that deer has actually affected its ability to survive. Our protocols would have us euthanize that deer. Again, our methods are pretty safe for turkeys, so that's pretty rare. What's slightly more common and still rare, I just want to highlight, it's still pretty rare, is the stress of the event, right? You get trapped under the net, you're stuck in a box for a few minutes. Now somebody's got a hold of you. We cover their eyes and we watch their physiology and their behavior. Because if we see any sign of stress, we have a protocol for how to release that bird. But it does happen that individuals, especially young ones, it seems, are more likely to die of stress. And so the really conservative way to do that is anything that happens within 2 weeks of handling. Most researchers remove those from the study. So even if, like, say you went to the doctor, let's be a human for a second, right? So your listeners can think what I mean. You go to the doctor and you're kind of nervous when you're in the room, right? Because they're going to poke and prod and they might draw blood and you don't like a needle, whatever. Well, how quick do you settle down after that stress event? If the answer is by tomorrow you're normal, that's how conservative we're being. We're giving them 2 weeks. And even if a great horned owl 13 days later comes down and kills that hen, we do not include that mortality as a great horned owl mortality, because we say, you know what, out of abundance of caution, anything that happens in 2 weeks could have been because we caused stress. Now, my personal, I'm going to say personal, but I hope someday I can say professional, because we don't have a lot of good data on this. I think it's probably a lot lower. I think a lot of hens within a matter of days are probably behaving exactly as they behaved before. But this is very common in wildlife. We do it on pronghorn, we do it on mule deer, we do it on elk, we do it on deer. 2 weeks just kind of became the standard because it absorbs that potential for our activity to bias the results of a study that otherwise cares a great deal about survival.
Right.
Yeah.
We don't want to report a survival estimate that's biased by the fact that we handled them. And that's probably about as deep as you want to go on a podcast, because beyond that, it's pretty science nerd stuff. But we do think about that because it's really hard to go to an agency and tell them with some level of certainty what survival is and what the causes of mortality are if that was muddy. If I can't stand by our own results because there may be biases in there that we're not accounting for, well, then ODWC is not going to get good information.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you said this will wrap up in about two years from now?
Yeah, I think that's right.
And
it's
then
all blurred together.
Yeah. And then from that point, how long will it be to get the information of what you guys learned or what the conclusion is?
Well, so that is a very fair question. Everything in science is way slower than the public wants.
Absolutely.
And it's way slower than I want, but there's a reason for that. And the good news is some of it is happening right now. So the very first master student on the Oklahoma Turkey Project is Nicole DeFilippo. She just defended her master's last week. So she will graduate, May of 2024, having completed the first wave of the Southeast Turkey stuff.
Oh, wow.
Which means some of that information, the nest success rates, the hen survival rates, how the poults were doing, which wasn't great. She's got some nest selection data. There's a host of things that she's doing right now that will be coming out by design while the project is still active. There are other things, of course, that we wanted to wait until there was 4 years of capture data before we do this analysis or that analysis. And so as a result, those results, sorry to be redundant, but as a result of that, as a consequence of that, those actual study results will come out even later. So yes, some of the things probably will be a year or two even after the project is officially over. The good news is that also means we collected a lot of data, because there are things we might learn in the process that we actually want to go back kind of retroactively and study. And, you know, that we had all those backpacks, the GPS points we collect are all archived in, you know, external hard drives and in the cloud and all that, which means, I mean, 10 years from now, a random student could come in and ask a new question of movement data from turkeys that they never even handled.
Wow.
So it's a push and pull in the science world. It takes a while to do stuff, but when you pile up enough data like that, it also means you can ask questions about it for a long time.
So you said you guys are looking at some nesting and some poult issues. What are you guys, do you have anything you're seeing there?
Yeah. So pretty standard metric in a lot of the turkey research is to look at what people call nest success or nest survival, which is basically the idea that if a hen starts to incubate, and the incubation is usually 28 to 29 days, that she's got to sit on those eggs, right? She's exposed to all kinds of risk in there. It's a really dangerous time to be a hen. You're not flying up in a roost every night because you're staying on your eggs, you know. And so we want to see what's the rate of nest success, i.e. how many of those that got started with incubation actually end up hatching at least one poult. And so far, you know, like I said, we're kind of partway through, so no big strong conclusions here, but, you know, low to average. In other words, there's a lot of turkey work that's been done. That's rarely a high number. Like we never expect it to be 90% of the nests are being successful. That would be kind of rare and crazy.
Right.
It's great for turkeys,
Yeah.
but it's just unlikely. There's too many factors that are influencing those hens and the nest and the potential for predation. So without kind of going from memory, I mean, you know, teens to 20s is not really that abnormal, 20 something percent success rate. You know, it may be lower than we want, but then the next step is the part that, at least so far in the Southeast, the few broods that we've had. So of the few successful nests, then do they actually grow a poult to an age that we could consider independent, right? Which a lot of people use about a month, you know, 28 days to a month, because at that point, you know, it can thermoregulate, or has been able to at that point for a couple of weeks. It can get up off the ground, again, has been able to for a couple of weeks. It can roost in trees. Their survival start to get better and better. Well, long story short, we had few nests successful, but of the ones that were, we could track the poults. We actually could not document a surviving poult from our marked hens yet in the first 2 years. So now I want to clarify that, because that's the reaction. Like you hear the like exhale, like, oh, that sounds horrible. Well, it doesn't mean that no poults were alive, but our marked hens, you know, we're tracking them. We know how many of them tried to lay a nest or tried to incubate a nest, how many of those incubators were successful. Of those that were successful, how many of those actually reared a poult? We had one hen get her entire brood to almost 3 weeks of age, and then she was killed by a predator.
Oh, no.
So, again, that doesn't mean that there's no poult surviving in McCurtain County. It's based, but what it does tell you is based on your sample.
Right.
It doesn't seem like it's high survival. And that's maybe not unsurprising. Again, we probably didn't expect it to be 100%, right? Everything walking around in the woods with, I mean, a little turkey poult's like a little Happy Meal bopping around. I mean, just name something that could eat a baseball-sized creature that's a protein packet. I mean, we found a poult in a cottonmouth.
Oh, wow.
That's not the first thing you think of. And I don't want your listeners to go, well, I told you we need to kill all the snakes. No, snakes have a role in all these ecosystems as well. But yeah, it does mean that if a poult happens to walk around the wrong log, there are snakes that could eat it, right? That hen, based on the evidence we had, the hen I just mentioned, We think she was attacked and killed by coyote. Well, then the poults were basically too young to fend for themselves. We can't account. I don't know that coyote sat there and ate all of them. What I do know, though, is those poults were never seen again, never detected again alive, because ultimately they succumb to other causes of mortality.
Yeah.
And when they're small enough, even just exposure. I mean, most turkey hunters know that. People talk all the time about wet springs and cold springs and cool snaps and warm snaps, right?
Right.
And when you're, again, a tiny little ball of feathers dependent on your mom to help you regulate your body temperature for at least 10 days, maybe even 2 weeks, exposure is a big thing. Never mind all the stuff trying to eat you. So I don't want to say that early result and panic people, because again, we'd be unsurprised that poult survival is low. But certainly over the first 2 years, and now going into nesting season number 3, certainly we would hope we'd have a brood or 2 make it, or a poult or 2 make it. And Cody did in Southwest Oklahoma. He had a marked poult make it to what we called independence, as well as some others that were unmarked that he was able to document. But I think still it was just 1 or 2 broods that he was monitoring that were successful. All the others he was monitoring were unsuccessful.
Do you think? Trying to ask this because everyone's gonna go point to predators.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that's a big deal? Like, because less people trap now.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that has any effect, or do you think it's a low effect? Do you think it's what I mean? What's your take on that statement?
Yeah, so that's a great question. It's a complicated answer, I think, and obviously as a scientist, I try to shoot that way, right? Mm-hmm. What's the evidence-based answer?
Yeah.
But when there's not, when we're lacking in some studies, and we are surprisingly, the predation component with turkeys is well known.
Yeah.
Like almost every study of hen survival, the leading cause of mortality of hens is predation. Every study of nest success, the leading cause of the loss of nests, whether you call it a predator event or a scavenging event, don't really care. Either way, the nest didn't hatch. Actually, it doesn't really matter to me whether they were a predator got it or a scavenger got it, because there's sometimes you hear arguments about those terms, and those terms are important. But if you're a turkey hunter, all you cared about is whether or not the nest was successful.
Right.
I think one of the complicated factors that the average person might not think about is how the landscape influences the predation context. So it would be easy, and maybe I wish it was easy, to say, well, there's less trappers, therefore there's more coyotes, or there's more bobcats, or there's more raccoons. Maybe in some places, and maybe not. What's going on at the same time there's less trappers, though, is there's been changes in how people put food out on the landscape, up to and including deer hunters putting out corn, right? Mm-hmm. That's kind of an open question in some circles. And even bird feeders in backyards wouldn't be immune to some level of scrutiny there. But what about the cover conditions?
Yeah.
There's been a lot said lately, again, people pushing rightly, I think, for more information, more manipulative experiments, trying to see how turkeys, especially hens, respond to habitat management. I don't know all the numbers off the top of my head, but in the southeastern U.S., right, we've got lots of areas covered in really thick, dense pasture grasses that, sure, a hen can walk around in, right? Mm. But she's big enough. Poults struggle through that. There's not near the forage there. There's not near the number of insects as would be in, more of a native grassland environment, right? So I'm not trying to dodge the predator question, but I think your question is a good one, and it's that we can't just say that if we nuked all the predators tomorrow, magically everything would be solved. By the same token, I don't think it would be fair not to acknowledge that, yes, predation in lots of studies is demonstrated to be a notable source of mortality for turkeys. And when you layer that on top of other things that may or may not be happening, whether it's disease or some sort of toxin or weather and climate related variables or cover, well, now you've got that complicated mix of variables. And my job, my students' job, and so many at other universities is to try to test those and get better and better scientific data so that we can actually point to the things that matter the most. So again, not trying to dodge that, but there is a lot of nuance. It's a really good question.
Let's take a break from this podcast and talk about some awesome products.
Hey folks, let me tell you about GritKnives. They're not just your average knife company. They're all about high quality, affordable, and unique products that'll make your outdoor adventures legendary. From limited edition pocket knives to rugged fixed blades and precision scalpels, they've got it all. Plus, their logo wear will have you repping the brand wherever you go. So whether you're out in the field or tackling everyday tasks, trust GritKnives to be your go-to for top-notch gear that won't break the bank.
Are you looking for some of the best sounding turkey calls on the market? Then look no farther than JAG Calls. Since 2022, Team OD has been using their calls and have had great success doing so. Two of my personal favorite calls are the Mother Clucker and the America. And I mean, if it has a name like that, it must be good. Check out JAG Calls, that's JAG Calls, out at jagcalls.com. Hey, and while you're at checkout, use OD 2024 for a discount. Once again, OD 2024 for your discount.
Now let's get back to today's episode.
So are you getting any upside information that you guys didn't even think about going into this study? Like any surprise information from any of your studies?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have something biological per se that's surprising, but there's two things that come into my mind that I'm enjoying as a side project off of the main project, and that is seeing the increase in technology available to go on something the size of a turkey. I mean, you hand me a bull elk that weighs somewhere between 600 and 800 pounds, I can hang just about anything around his neck that we need. He never even gonna know it's there. Smaller animals, we can't do that, right? But we're getting to the point now where many different projects are using really like cutting edge GPS units with accelerometry data. I mean, my student was looking at accelerometers and can see a roosted hen swaying on the limb.
Oh, wow.
With the data that comes off the backpack. What I mean is when the wind blows at night.
Yeah.
Because the accelerometer is working on like your axis of your body, right? The axis of tilting forward and back or left or right. And he showed me a plot of it one day, and it's like, holy crap. Like you can actually tell that the wind's blowing. She's sitting still, but she's just doing this with the tree she's in. So that's really cool. And the other thing is, honestly, it's stuff like this. The number of people that care about the turkey decline. I mean, it feels like people are coming out of the woodwork.
Right.
Hunters, landowners, state agencies, nonprofits like NWTF, Turkeys for Tomorrow, right? TFT, which is a newer player in the NGO game. But all of them, like the ones that are coming out with funding, are trying to send money to projects. Landowners are contacting me on Instagram saying like, well, I don't have a tissue sample to give, but if you ever need to trap birds, I got 20 that use my back 40. And which is, I mean, we don't get to just magically catch birds everywhere we want to.
Right.
But the fact that I feel like that was a legit offer, and I've gotten a dozen of people that I feel like if I just messaged them back and said, hey, we need to trap 5 turkeys, they would say, sure. Well, every little bit of that helps, right? Because it's all momentum in the right direction. And so I don't know why I wouldn't have expected that. And I don't mean to sound negative that I didn't, but I was so focused on the science and the questions that only after I got into it did I realize like, man, there's a huge push here for hunters, especially, but also others in the general public and agencies to get these answers. There's probably more turkey research going on right now than ever. And that includes the fact that it wasn't that many decades ago that some of these states were famously doing one of the biggest restorations of all time, right?
Right.
I mean, white-tailed deer and turkeys are two of our conservation success stories. I mean, we talk about them in class, they're in books, right? So I've been really impressed with the number of people that are trying to engage with the problem.
So who'd you say was the guy that had the information that could see the turkeys rocking back and forth?
So the PhD student here at OSU working on the Rio Grande part is Cody Griffin.
Have you seen him in a couple of days? Because with this wind, I feel like he could be seasick if he's watching those charts.
Yeah. Well, you're right. That's actually, again, the strength of collecting the data and being able to look back at it, because day to day, like today, he's probably in the field. He's getting the rest of his cameras out because we have a camera monitoring objective that we do during nesting. He and his crew are monitoring all those current hens, downloading their points, trying to identify the first incubation of the year. As we record this, we're on the 12th. I think our first nest in southeast Oklahoma for the last couple of years, our first incubation date that we could document was right around 16th to 19th. Wow. So in other words, it's coming, right? So his day-to-day right now is so busy, he probably doesn't have a lot of downtime to just look through data. But when he does, that's what he can do. Like, that's the power of collecting so much, is now you can look back and go, I want to see how they acted when that big storm front came through, and he's dabbled at that a little bit. Last spring, there was a big line of storms that pushed through. I think in some areas they had like baseball sized hail out there. Now, we didn't see any mortality from that, but again, it just takes one wrong hailstone. If you're a turkey hen sitting on a nest, and you're dead. Yeah. Right. And I have colleagues that have seen that with like greater prairie chicken, where the hen and the entire brood can be killed in a storm event. Again, that's not going to be everywhere, because we know as Oklahomans that watch the weather, those storms can be real patchy. A horrible tornado in one place 5 miles away barely got any rain. Right. So yes, that's a long answer, that like when our crews have time, they're looking at that, because the more they poke and prod what the data can do, the more we can ask questions around something as simple as, how bad does the wind blow before she jumps out of the tree? He has, I think, I don't want to overshare if I'm wrong, but I think he told me he found one that he thought was actually ground roosted during a storm, because it was blowing too much. And we don't know that she was blown out of the tree, but the data from the backpack makes it seem like, whether purposeful or accidentally, she ended up on the ground and spent the rest of the night on the ground. Wow. Now, again, if you're a turkey, you don't really ever want to be on the ground. Right. But maybe in that particular tree, that was safer than staying up there. But 20 years ago, not a chance. Unless you watched it happen, not a chance you get that from a backpack. Yeah, I've been clicking through and watching Mossy Oak put out a whole documentary about the fox and the colonial. They were, on opposite ends of the world or in the United States, and how they did all this turkey project. And even they have a video talking about 2009, talking about like what, wow, look what electronics is doing for us now. Look what software. And then they had them, last year when they recorded it, talking about it. And they said from 2009 to 2023, 24, they're like, that jump was even better than the 90s to 2009. It's amazing. And we, the wildlife science field as a whole, that's exactly what it's been like. I mean, I started in my master's in 2007, and I didn't use collars or of any kind on my master's work, but I did on my PhD. Yeah. So we spent more per collar on the white-tailed deer collars in 2011 and 2012 than I now spend on pronghorn and mule deer, and the collars are like half the size. Yeah. They last longer. They collect data at even more frequent intervals. They transmit it reliably through a satellite. Our grant pays essentially a monthly fee for that to basically come to our computer, so the students can be monitoring. I mean, it's not quite real time, but it's getting dang close. Wow. So absolutely, like even in my career, I'm young enough in my career compared to some of the older folks, but in that time from say 2010 to now, it's amazing what you can get off a device that you hang around a pronghorn's neck. And I've seen this on social media and people complaining, but I think it's the simple fact of them not understanding that
putting on the backpack does not hurt the animal, or you guys wouldn't be doing that. So can you kind of go through the process and kind of, demonstrate out what the sizes of the backpack is and how it's put on the animal?
Yeah. So we kind of touched on this at the beginning. It's the same idea with everything. Basically, the research shows that it's by percent of body weight. So all the transmitters that we buy, there are multiple companies that sell them. And we might be after a certain technology. There's reasons you might pick one company over another, but what all those companies are doing is producing the smallest, lightest backpack they can provide to still get you the data. And that's a trade-off. The bigger the battery they put in it, the longer I can collect data. But the bigger the battery, the heavier the backpack. Right. So as that technology gets better, what happens? That battery gets smaller and smaller. I mean, think about cell phones. Everybody, we got all our cell phones in here are basically laptops.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. So that would have been unheard of when cell phones first came out, the power that they had in them, the ability to do what they do. So we're doing the same thing. Once we've got the bird in hand, there are things that we do to reduce stress. I mentioned before, say we're rocket netting, right? That's a big boom. It's loud. I'm not going to lie. It's an explosion. Net goes over top of them. They're just pinned to the ground. We basically get them out of the net and they go straight into a slightly fancier cardboard box, which is generally dark, cooler. They're placed in the shade. We're not trying to overheat anything. That's in Oklahoma. It's far more likely that we're worried about heat, not cold. Right. And so when it's their turn, we pull them out of the box. We put essentially my crew, my grad student, she had actual old socks or whatever. And she just cut the toe out of it.
Yeah.
And one of them I came there was purple on this hand and pink on that hand, so they've got their eyes covered, again, designed to kind of calm them down. Turkeys are real easy to deal with. They're not trying to beat you to death most of the time. If they sense a way to get away, they'd like to, but they're not sitting there panicking. And then now to answer your question directly, the backpack goes on with a harness. So it's actually a marine shock cord, okay, that, without going into detail, like the backpacks are set up slightly differently, but basically it's connected on each end, and the shock cord goes like under their wing, like under their armpit, so that the device is right in between their shoulder blades. So when they're just standing there, matter of fact, if you don't know what to look for, there's undoubtedly been hunters see a hen walk by and not even know she had a backpack on.
Oh, wow.
Because by the time they preen their feathers a few days later, a lot of those feathers actually covering up the device. We're talking about something, again, depending on the style, definitely narrower than the average man's wallet, right? So, more long than wide or tall, but in its weight per gram, it's well below the threshold that we use for the weight on the individual. This is why, for example, like you couldn't strap this to a hummingbird, right? Yeah. This device would be way too big for a hummingbird. It'd be way too big for a mourning dove. So we have to have smaller devices to go on them. At ratio, we try to keep the same either way. But that marine shock cord it weathers really well. They can break off, but it's usually because they've been on for a long time. And it allows them full range of motion. So that's what everybody always says, like, well, you put that transmitter on it, she can't even fly up in the roost. Well, I got some data to say otherwise. You cannot believe me, but I mean, thousands of turkeys have been tagged this way for decades. Honestly, it's quite safe. It's quite effective. It doesn't mean that we're not at some level potentially causing risk. It's unfair for me to say otherwise. This is my favorite science saying, there's a non-zero probability that my handling that bird, right, could harm it. Our job is to keep that probability as low as possible. Yep. And we do that by keeping the weight down, the size down, keeping the handling to a minimum, following all these protocols. We take blood. Well, if a technician is learning how to do that and can't do it fast enough, right, struggling a little bit, we don't try. It's like, okay, that's good, but that's enough on that hen. We move on. We don't need that blood sample. We have like a priority list of what we need. She got her backpack, she got her leg band. At the end of the day, that's the objective number one for our project. Right. We try to collect those other data while we have them in hand, because why not? But people have to learn. There are mitigating circumstances. If it got really hot one day, we don't trap. I was in the backup truck the first year when Nicole was in the blind with a technician. I think she was targeted. It was like a group of 7 hens. They came to the bait. Me and Dr. Dwayne Elmore were in one truck. We didn't have any service, but the other technician was in another truck, and she did have service. And it had been kind of like drizzly all morning, and we were like, we got to be careful because we don't want it to be too wet. It can actually make it easier to pull their feathers off under the net. We don't want that to happen. So she's saying they came in, but Nicole's asking us. Nicole thinks it's too wet, and I had seen the trapping site, and it was mostly grass and a little clearing. And I looked at Dwayne and I was like, man, it's not worth it. That's our job and Nicole's too, right? If we'd not been there, her instinct was right. We'd like to catch those 7 birds, but not at the expense of potentially killing one.
Absolutely.
Because it lands in the puddle and drowns before we can get out there, right? Or it loses too many feathers and now can't thermoregulate well when it flies up on the limb tonight and it's cold and wet. So she texted, and Nicole had to sit there for like 15 minutes and watch these hens right there ready to go eat out of her little corn pile in front of her net, or might have been Milo, and then slowly let them walk off. And once they walked off, we drove in to pick her up. And again, a lot of hunters who might mean well, they don't even know that stuff's going on. That a lot of these research teams are putting in day after day after day after day, and sometimes having to sit there and watch their target walk away because it's raining too much, right? So a fair question on how our stuff might injure or harm turkeys, but at the end of the day, I feel really confident saying no. The wing harness and the backpack is not the problem here. There are other things that are the problem, and that's what we're trying to figure out.
Have you had any hunter harvest on like a bearded hen, anything like that?
We have not yet. So I'm trying to think.
I wouldn't mind if they just took that off the regs right there.
Well, it would be one way to just have a few less hens die. But our secret is the hens. When the hunter kills a gobbler, right, and you want to take the beard off, you cut with the skin. You take that little lump of skin with it, and then you put your borax or salt on it or whatever. Well, beard's just a modified feather anyway. Well, we just snip it off because we don't want her to die. We're not studying. This project is not about hunter harvest. We wouldn't do that if we were studying hunter harvest because that would be a bias. But what we do want is for the average law-abiding hunter, if they see that hen, not to go, "Ooh, beard, bang."
Yes.
Because you're right. Then our $1,000 transmitter potentially gets hit by a shotgun pellet, or doesn't get returned, or they panic and think I've done something illegal. In that case, they hadn't done anything illegal, but they could cut it off and bury it, or drop it in a lake, and then we can't find it. It all depends on the type of transmitter as to how easy it is for us to recover. But so I don't want to encourage that. In other words, if a hunter was in a spot where they knew there were toms that had backpacks and it's legal to harvest them, then go ahead. But then do what that backpack says, do what those local bios are saying, and make sure to turn that in, because if you care about the resource, then you should care about getting that data back, getting that device back to that team, because they're not cheap. Like I said, they're running, depending on the GPS unit, easy $900 to $1,200 a backpack. And so in our case, we have had a few bearded hens in the southeast, and we obviously don't cut her skin, but just above, we just snip it off. So then when you rub her chest feathers down, it'll grow. She'll end up with a beard again, undoubtedly. But because I'm usually catching her in February, maybe March, she's not going to have a visible beard in April and May, which means somebody that shoots her is a poacher anyway. Right. So that's been our answer. But we have not had we have not even had a documented poaching event that I can recall.
That's a little surprising.
I know. And we thought the same thing. There was one that they were worried about in the southeast enough that a game warden was involved with Nicole, and they used a metal detector and everything because they were trying to figure out if it had been shot, even if it had been shot in a different location and moved. And long story short, there was no evidence of foul play. It was just one of those weird events where they couldn't quite figure out what had happened. But that's the good news, because we were, poaching is a thing. We've had some pronghorn poached on the pronghorn project. Yeah.
So for listeners too, I understand what it is, Gunner know what it is, but I think it'd be great for you to go and kind of describe what thermoregulate is, how turkeys thermoregulate, and how they use that as survival. I think that'd be a good topic because it's mentioned several times in this podcast.
Okay, sure. So the simple way to think about it is like, so everybody's going to go for opening day. Well, I'm not, because I got meetings I can't get out of, but y'all are, right? And let's say, even by Oklahoma standards, there's a little chill in there, right? So whether to wear the base layer, or, well, I don't really want to wear the base layer because I know it's going to get hot later. So I'm gonna wear my regular shirt, but I'm gonna just throw on this light jacket. Well, then when it gets warm, you take the jacket off, right? All the animals we're talking about today, right? An elk can have a summer coat and a winter coat, right? A deer can do that, but that's it. They can't swap back and forth the way we can. And for something like a poult, it's even worse. Their actual regulatory system in their body, and those tiny little down feathers that make poults so precious, y'all know. So you can insert a photo right here if you want. They're really cute, right? They're little fuzz balls, but they don't have those protective feathers that, of course, we look at as hunters, like, oh, like how pretty that gobbler is, and they've got that sheen. Well, a lot of those exterior feathers there, they're also protecting the feathers underneath as well, that kind of insulate. And so again, day wise, you're probably looking at, on the low end, about day 10, somewhere around 2 weeks, maybe even as late as about 20 days, somewhere in that 10 to 20 day span. The two most important things are happening. One, they've got enough feather growth that they can fly at least enough to get up off the ground at night. And instead of being brooded by the hen, which is where the hen hunkers down on the ground and they kind of tuck up under her, right? And she kind of fluffs her wings out. And y'all have seen, lots of people's at least seen a photo of that.
Absolutely.
That's it. That is to keep those poults warm enough at a time of the year where that temperature dips a little bit at night, and they don't have the capability yet to stay warm enough themselves. And that's why you hear all the stories about ill-timed rain or ill-timed cold snaps or whatever. It's usually that, at least in southern latitudes, right? It's usually that dip in the temperature that we're most worried about. And so in that case, the hen is the buffer. Her feathers and her warmth and her body size are actually helping that brood survive until they reach that threshold where their bodies have gotten big enough, their physiology has caught up, and now they're doing a better job, like we do today. Long sleeve, short sleeve, we can all regulate our temperature well enough that none of us are gonna freeze to death or get too hot here in the office today. Well, now they're doing that out in the world, and they can get up off the ground. And that is a big step for a baby turkey, because already you've now limited some of the things that have access to you by being up even just a few feet off the ground with the hen. I think that probably answers the question, but yeah.
So real quick, we've kind of run out of time. Is there anything else that you guys are looking for, or you want to tell the people about this research real quick?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, especially for this spring, would be it's our last little push to get those genetic samples. And so listeners who are interested in contributing, like I said, worst sacrifice is about a dime-sized piece of meat. You can cut the little tip off the breast. You can take a chunk out of the drumstick. Whatever you feel like sacrificing, we're going to end up just needing that little tiny eraser-sized piece that goes in a vial. And folks can reach out. If they follow social media, maybe y'all can provide the links to it and everything. I know y'all have seen it, but it's going to get shared. We're going to reshare it here as the season comes on to remind people. But my email is in those posts. They can email me directly. I add them to a big spreadsheet. And then if they get one, well, like I said, they don't even have to contact me now. If you get one and want to contact me, then I get your address. I can mail you a kit. or the Texas folks can mail it direct from down there. And if the other way is just with Instagram, which we use. We do put out updates that way. We try to. It's not every day. It's not even every week. And it's not always turkeys. But a lot of your listeners probably would be interested in a lot of what my lab does. So I'm at Big Game Doc, and that post will be on there. And I do have hunters and landowners, send the DM real quick, like, hey, I got a bird. Here's my address. Well, that's another way to reach me. And otherwise follow along, because as you alluded to earlier, we're far enough now that we're starting to have shareable results. And one of the ways we get that out is sometimes even just a photo or two, a fact or two that can go out over social media, because a lot of people, they can consume that bits and pieces at a time. We know not every hunter is going to read a full scientific paper.
Right.
But if they've got questions about what nest survival is looking like, those numbers we're starting to have those numbers in the Southeast and the Southwest. And so that'll go out through multiple social media channels, and ODWC shares stuff as well. And sometimes they're just fun, just fun videos of, like, I think one of the recent ones that people might have seen was a mule deer being slung into our processing site, So there's not a lot of data there yet, but it was just, ODWC just wanted to share it as like, hey, this is really cool, because we're actually doing a project on a species that's native to Oklahoma, and yet we know kind of where they are, but we don't really even know how many and how patchily they're distributed. So it's neat to be a part of a project in that way that's pretty novel for this part of the country anyway.
So if anyone need to reach out to you, what's your contact? And then if they're interested in some of the research you do, is there a place they can search on Google or look up to see what kind of you've been doing?
Yeah, if you Google my name, I do have a lab website, but it's not updated with results per se. I think people find it, and it's also behind even right now. If you went and found it, it's not even got all the current projects on it or the current students. But the best way to contribute related to the project, a direct email, which is coulter.chitwood@okstate.edu.
Okay.
That's just my work address here at OSU. That'll be on those posts. And then again, because I do run what little bit of social media stuff my lab does is through my @BigGameDoc on Instagram. And like I said, that it's fine if somebody says, hey, I got one, here's my address. Well, I'm going to take that address, put it in a spreadsheet, get it to the right people, and then they're going to send a kit.
Okay.
And I should add one more thing, that if folks follow up and actually look at that post, this is not to dissuade hunters from getting birds wherever they can get them, but we are targeting this year more the counties that we're missing data from, or that we have very little data. So if you look on there and you're like, dang, my county's not on there, I can't contribute. Well, you can always shoot me a message and I can check. There may be some that we're willing to take a few more, but the reason those specific counties are listed is because some of those we have 0 from, and others we may only have 1 or 2, and he needs some more.
Okay.
So that's a special nod to the folks who find their county on that list. I've already been contacted by one who said, I hunt in this, and this. I don't remember what they were. All 3 were on the list. And I was like, well, then, yes, I need anything you can send, and tell your friends, you know, because it just by luck, those counties had just not had samples for the last couple of years.
So to our listeners, all this will be linked in the description below. We'll do the email. We'll do any resources I can get for Instagram and the online website. So, but Dr. Chitwood, thank you for coming on and going over turkeys. I knew we were going to dive in elk a little bit, but hey, we'll come back another day. When you got 3 people like this, there's more words than there are time. So, but thank you for coming on. Our listeners, this is episode number 13, and thanks for listening.